If we lose this forest, if we savage the land, we might as well be cutting off our own right hand. For we and the earth are one, under the moon, under the sun. If we lose this forest, if we savage the land, we might as well be cutting off our own right hand. For we and the earth are one, under the moon, under the sun. When Marie Lynn Hammond wrote those lyrics decades ago, she was referring to the struggle to save the old growth forest in Temagami. Well, today the struggle is similar and the message is the same, but the lands are even much further north. The carbon-rich peatlands, which you see in this photograph behind me by Garth Lentz. We hope that by the end of the evening, you'll have a deeper understanding of these so-called breathing lands and their importance, not only for Indigenous communities, but indeed for all of us, for all our relations. It's great to see so many of you tuning in from across Canada, from Newfoundland all the way to Alberta. And thank you so much for putting in your greetings in the chat, for identifying the Indigenous territories on which you stand. My name is Deborah Bart, and I'm one of more than 150 members of Seniors for Climate Action Now, or SCAN. And we are co-sponsoring this event together with Environment Halliburton. We're committed to using this election period to educate ourselves and a broader public around the climate crisis and climate justice solutions, and particular to learn from Indigenous worldviews. This is how the evening will unfold. After a land acknowledgement and an introduction to SCAN, we are honored to have a conversation with two climate justice activists, Donna Ashimok and Dana Nadine Scott, an Indigenous settler pair who have worked together in the region. We hope that you will leave not only more informed, but also inspired and ready to act. Please put your questions in the chat for a Q&A, and feel free to stay on for another 30 minutes after the formal closing as we continue the conversation informally. This session will be recorded. And now I'll invite my Sister SCAN member, Pat Hayward, to offer a land acknowledgement. Over to you, Pat.
Thank you. I will begin by expressing gratitude for the season of spring that has come to the country called Canada and to the area of Toronto where I live. This land, originally known as Tkaronto, was obtained or settled with varying degrees of legality, interpretation, and understanding under the Williams Treaty, the Mississauga Treaty, and the Toronto Purchase. Yet before these treaties were made with the colonial governments, the various Indigenous nations crafted their own treaties, an important one being the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. This covenant is an understanding of how to responsibly and peacefully share and care for the resources available to all in this vast area of the Great Lakes. I acknowledge that here in Tkaronto, we inhabit the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Petun, Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit. We understand the connections mentioned in any land acknowledgement extend beyond land to include the waters and rock forms, animals and creatures, all parts of created life. We are called to accept our responsibility to continue the care and stewardship of this land as First Nations have modeled for us in previous and into present times. I acknowledge how deeply we benefit from the many ways that Indigenous cultures, knowledge, and presence continue to nurture this land. We are grateful to be here and to honor these lands and Indigenous heritage. May it be so. Miigwech. I now call on John Hewitt, who will give an introduction to our event.
Thank you, Pat. You have really firmly grounded our conversation tonight in our relationship to the land and to the peoples indigenous to this land who have cared for it for millennia and continue to care for it today. Hi, everyone. A warm welcome to everybody. My name is John Huot. I'm a member of Seniors for Climate Action Now, otherwise known as SCAN, and of SCAN's Indigenous Solidarity Committee, which organized tonight's event. Seniors for Climate Action Now is a new Ontario-based climate action organization. We are seniors organizing seniors to demand urgent action to deal with the causes and effective solutions to the climate crisis. We are committed to climate justice. We demand that climate solutions reduce inequality and prioritize concrete improvements in the lives of workers, racialized communities, and women who already suffer most from the effects of the climate crisis. As seniors, we are inspired by the Indigenous wisdom that elders have a special responsibility to ensure that all life on Earth is sustainable for our children, our grandchildren, and future generations. SCAN also recognizes that Indigenous peoples are key leaders in addressing the climate emergency in Canada and globally. First, we recognize that the historic and ongoing effects of colonialism and land dispossession means that Indigenous peoples experience disproportionately the impacts of the climate crisis. Second, we recognize that Indigenous peoples are key leaders in mobilizing opposition to the causes of the climate crisis. They do this by asserting full sovereignty over their traditional lands where fossil fuel production and transportation are located. And very importantly, they also point the way to climate solutions based on their traditional knowledges and practices in caring for the land. Tonight's event is part of SCAN's Ontario election campaign. SCAN's goal is to shine a light on critical climate issues in Ontario, on the false solutions of the Ford government, and on the real effective solutions Ontario desperately needs to do its part to address the climate emergency. Tonight's topic addresses what is perhaps one of the most important Indigenous rights issues in the current Ontario election. The Ford government's push for mining development in the so-called Ring of Fire in Northern Ontario is a threat both to Indigenous rights and to nature-based climate solutions in the vast peatlands in the region. This is also a timely topic, given that this is Northern Ontario Week in the Ontario election campaign, with the First Leaders debate on last Tuesday in North Bay and the focus on Northern Ontario issues by all the parties. However, the usual pattern is that the North is forgotten after this minimal attention early in the election campaign. SCAN will not forget, because Indigenous rights will remain at the center of our work to address the climate emergency in the years to come. We look forward to learning more about how Indigenous peoples in the region are responding to the threats to their rights and to the breathing lands that sustain our lives and all life on Earth. I will now pass the baton to Deborah, our moderator, to introduce how the event will flow this evening.
Thank you, John. I have the honor of welcoming our two special guests, Donna Ashamek, who is sitting in KI 1,366 kilometers from here, and in Big Trout Lake, KI, and with Dana Nadine Scott, who's just a few blocks over from me in this neighborhood in West Toronto. And I want to invite them to have some tea at my table. We're going to have a conversation over the next hour or so, but before we sit down to talk, we need to set the table or the scene with a short video. And after that, both Donna and Dana will introduce themselves, and then we'll start a conversation that's catalyzed by some questions that have been posed by members of the Indigenous Solidarity Committee of SCAN. So we want your questions too, and so please add them to the chat, and we'll have 15 minutes after our conversation for our guests to respond, and perhaps longer if you're able to stay beyond the formal closing, because we have some chat time 30 minutes afterwards. So for those of us in the southern edge of so-called Canada, the region of Northern Ontario we're focusing on is often out of sight and out of mind. So this video that we'll share brings the breathing lands into our kitchens, our dining rooms, wherever you're sitting, and allows us to hear the voices of the Indigenous elders, leaders, and the youth who live on and with this land and have been from time immemorial. Eric?
Welcome to your new role, Minister Guilbeault.
We hear you care about the rights of Indigenous people, but we're concerned you may not have been properly briefed about the Ring of Fire.
Why else would you have recently signed off on a terms of reference that cut Indigenous peoples out of decision-making roles on their own lands? Let us help you.
Allow us to provide you with the Treaty People's briefing on what's been going on with the Ring of Fire before you got here.
You've probably heard that Indigenous people support this project, but there's more to the story.
Okay, hello, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Wayne Munias. I'm the chief of Niskandiga. I just wanted to say that I think it's important, the involvement and informed participation of our people is so critical, because we're the ones that live on this land. We're the ones that live and breed from these lands and the resources that come from what the Creator gave us. So that's very important. I think that's something that we need to remain steadfast and committed to, because it's not just for today, but it's for the future generations. Future generations are our future. And if we're going to sustain our way of life and the future generations to be able to have those opportunities, we have to make sure that our people are the ones that are determining what's going to happen in our area.
I just want to share something regarding the youths. I got my granddaughter who's 14 at the moment, and she loves her land very much, and it shows because she's going to the land by herself. She even takes herself up the river through the rapids by herself. At the early age, maybe 2 years ago, she started doing that. She showed that she loves her land, and she even goes moose hunting. Like last week, she went moose hunting. That's what she loves to do. I just want to share that she just loves her land, going out, going fishing alone, as her grandpa taught her from the younger years. She doesn't have to depend on anybody to go with her. The young generations shows us that they love their land.
And a lot of people think that, Niskandiga doesn't support anything. What we support is the continuance way of life of our people. so that next generations like Dorothy's granddaughter, the grandkids that we have in the community are able to enjoy not just themselves, but the next generations that comes after them, and so on. That's what we're talking about here. It goes beyond developing a project, because we heard from Gary about the impacts when communities are not fully involved, when money is the driver of these developments, when it's short-sighted in that means, things get forgotten. And that's what we are not prepared to do as a First Nation. And that's why we say that we're going to stand for our rights. We're going to stand for Mother Earth. We're going to stand for the river system, the animals that are not able to speak at the tables that we sit across from industry and governments. That's why we say those things. And we mean what we say. And we practice with the truest sense when it comes to honoring our way of life. That's what it boils down to. A lot of people in our community probably think that it's the simplest way of explaining it. But people out there don't necessarily understand it. It's the continuance of who you are as an Anishinaabe. It's to be able to make sure that those things continue. Like anybody else. It's like anybody else. We have families, we have our own beliefs, cultures, and all that. We only want to continue what we believe in based on our values and principles and whatever we have in our own culture and so on. When we're talking about First Nations up north that are remote, that have a very different way of life, a lot of people don't understand that we still use the land for sustenance. We still use it to feed our elders, to feed our families. We still fish and hunt. We still practice our way of life. And that's something that we cannot trade for development that's not going to take into account how we're going to protect the environment, how we're going to protect animals, and how also we're going to continue the way of life of our people, not just today, but for future generations. And there's been very little engagement in terms of getting the free, prior, informed consent of our people. That has to take place before any decisions are made to how they're going to access, if in fact they're going to be allowed to access our land. That decision lies with our people. That decision lies with our community. And it's important. It's important that the respect has to be given to our people. To be able to say what's going to happen on our land, not somebody else to dictate how that's going to be. There's proponents that are coming to our community wishing to access our land, and yet they're getting permits from the government without our say. And that has to change. That has to change. We have a community process in place that allows engagement. More importantly, that allows the consent of our people. And today the government of Canada, the government of Ontario, the proponent, the industry is not able to get that consent from our people. Until such time those decisions are made by our people, access to our land is a no-go. Thank you very much, Migach.
There are so many things to consider in making a huge decision like this. Let's start fresh in a better way. Please act now to stop the current regional assessment and instead allow Indigenous peoples to lead a process to determine the future of their homelands. In your own words, Indigenous peoples have been stewards of this planet since time immemorial. The fight against climate change is not possible without their knowledge and leadership. Any agreement on a path forward must protect the rights of Indigenous peoples, full stop. You said that. We want to take you at your word, Minister Guilbeault. Do the right thing.
Oof. So these people, these voices in that land are familiar to our two guests tonight because both Donna Ashmock and Dana Scott have worked together, collaborating on the so-called development, issues related to the so-called development of the Ring of Fire region of Northern Ontario, the rights of Indigenous communities to lead their own assessment processes, to make decisions about future developments and to maintain their way of life. They're speaking from very different locations, and we've asked them to introduce themselves so that you can learn from them where they're standing, locating themselves both in the land and in this conversation. Donna, would you like to begin?
Sure. Can you hear me all right?
We just need to see you. Okay.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for having me here. It's a great opportunity to share and amplify an Indigenous voice. And when I say an Indigenous voice, I'm just at this point saying as Indigenous peoples, there's much to learn from all the Indigenous nations, and there are principles that we go by that are common because we are tied to the land. And I thank you for that message that you had shared. Wayne Munoz and Dorothy Sackney in the video said a lot that I will be amplifying shortly. So my name is Donna Ashmog. I am currently home in Kitchimigassiv Inuk. I'm originally from Moose Factory, Ontario. My community is Moose Factory, Mo Quebec. It was a self-defined community. It's changed over the last 10 years, but that's still my home, Moose Factory. So I'm here now, living here for the last 2 days, and it's wonderful being in the North. I support other Indigenous communities who are resisting mining that tends to not listen to Indigenous peoples, and being here in the North is, it means a lot. It means being connected to this land and to be able to harvest medicines. I'm really enjoying my life at this time. Let me go ahead.
Did you want to share your slides now?
Sure. I will hit the share screen. I'm actually not finding that button.
Share screen at the bottom.
Okay, yes. All right. And can you see the screen?
Mhm. Yes, perfect.
Great. All right. Would you like me to go through the slides as part of my introduction?
Yes, please.
Okay. I call this Protecting the Land, and it's a photo essay of the breathing lands. And as you know, we'll have maps shortly, but I wanted to tell you about what this means to us. And as you can see, there are some pictures. I didn't include any copyright photos or maps at this point. I know Dana will be sharing some shortly, but I wanted to give you a sense of how big the North is. And I mean, beyond borders, it's huge. What we call Canada, as you can see in any map, it's very large land mass. Here in Northern Ontario, KI is about 650 kilometers northwest of Thunder Bay. So you can see on this particular slide, just below Hudson Bay, there's a blue dot. That's where KI is. We're right on a big lake. Over to the east, here it's the right side of the screen, just below Hudson Bay and just above the Great Lakes are the breathing lands. And it's not just particular to the proposed Ring of Fire mine site, which is, by the way, proposed to be the size of Germany, just to give you an idea. But these breathing lands, it's not just peat moss, diverse landscapes, lots of fish, different kinds of fish, the waterways. If you look at a map with all the waterways, those are what we would call our highways in the North. We traveled across the frozen muskeg. We traveled by boat, canoe, across portage traditionally. And when folks go out to their camps, not just their trap lines, but their traditional lands where there are burial grounds, it's connected to the water. The land is it's massive. So when you look at that map, you'll see major rivers going into James Bay. And this is what we call the breathing lands. It's not, again, one particular area. It just stretches right across, and we're connected that way. So this is just an idea of giving you what the land looks like, not just in northwestern Ontario, but also towards the James Bay, the west coast of James Bay. You can see, again, these are pictures, not drone shots, but from a plane. And there's also my backyard. You can see the canoes. And here are more pictures of the landscape. And this is where, this is Big Trout Lake now. It's a huge water, a huge lake. Like in many areas, Indigenous peoples rely on the land, the rivers, to harvest our medicines, to harvest the fish, to hunt caribou, moose. And again, some more pictures of Big Trout Lake, but also of Moose River. And there's a picture of home of the former Cree Village Eco Lodge. And I'll get into that a little more under political economy, Indigenous political economy. More relatives. These were recent pictures of here locally in the yard, but also just heading out of the reserve community. And then more pictures of, this is also what we do back home in Moose Factory. We hunt, we harvest fish. You can see how the fish are being dried. The trout is being dried. There's a picture of the Shabaton, which is a traditional dwelling. More medicines, Labrador tea, you might see, willow. Fish is primarily one of the staples. And then again, I think this is the last shot of the landscapes. And I wanted to leave that with you because it really is about relationships and not just human to human. It's the survival of species, not just the survival of the human species. We are all relatives. And when we harvest, when we live as human beings in this world, in a cash-based economy, we impact what happens in the natural world. And I've taken much of my time in my life. Some people will call it activism. I just call it a way of life to protect what we have. The breathing lands, it's a proposed mine site that's being planned, that's being talked about right now. I see it as a mega project that if it goes through, what's to stop other mega projects from happening? And so I feel like this forum gives an opportunity to speak more about how we can stop it, how we can work with Indigenous peoples, especially in this provincial election coming up. And just to leave that with you, supporting Indigenous sovereignty, Indigenous autonomy is important. And it's timely. This is the perfect opportunity to stand up, start transforming this economy into something that's more regenerative. I'll leave it at that for now. Miigwech.
Wow. Yes. Thank you so much, Miigwech Donna, for bringing us into your land and with all your relatives, with all the relations. It was so vital, and we can feel those connections and your deep connection to them, and the importance of protecting all our relations. And you've actually moved already into thinking about what we need to be doing and giving us a sense of what we're facing with this current development in the Ring of Fire. So we're going to be going deeper into that in some of the next questions, but I want to first ask Dana if she would introduce herself. And I know where you're sitting now, but give us a little sense of where you're coming from and how you come into this conversation. Dana.
Sure, thanks very much. Miigwech Donna, always an honor to be alongside Donna in any of these discussions. And I also, of course, appreciate hearing the words from Chief Wayne. There's a lot of things that we won't be able to say more eloquently than Chief Wayne did in those videos that you got to see, and of course, Dorothy Sakany as well. So I'm speaking from Toronto, and I did really appreciate what Patricia said about the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. And, you know, I've been thinking a little bit more about that agreement recently, and not just about the kind of peaceable sharing aspects of it, which are often highlighted in the land acknowledgements. But I'm drawn to what Leanne Simpson has said about the Dish with One Spoon Wampum. She calls it a, quote, ancient template for realizing separate jurisdictions within a shared territory. And I think what that contains is a really powerful, like, political call to action, in line with what Donna just said about Indigenous sovereignty, right? In terms of thinking about how can we actually bring into being these separate jurisdictions on this shared territory. And by that, I mean exclusive Indigenous jurisdiction over homelands, and then maybe shared jurisdictions over some things, and maybe some settler jurisdictions as well. But the idea that the settler state, the kind of Canada and the provinces, you know, has exclusive authority over all of the lands within its so-called borders is just not tenable. It never was, and as Donna said, it just can't be anymore. And so I think that's necessary both for, like, thinking about a decolonial constitutional order in the future, and also for thinking about climate justice. So I think it's, I appreciated what John was saying about SCAN's mandate, and I think we'll probably circle back on that later. So I'm supposed to be introducing myself. I'm a law professor, a mom, I'm an environmental justice activist, and I've been working as part of a collective of scholars and community-based researchers and land defenders over several years, and I've been privileged to learn from many of them. Also a member of the Friends of the Attawapiskat River group that had a hand in putting together those amazing treaty peoples briefings that we saw one of a little bit earlier, which has been fantastic. I love those videos. So I've also been working with Donna, I think it's almost 6 years ago now, and we've done a variety of road trips and other events, community workshops through the north in KI, in Nishtantega, and in Pewanik. And that's been a fantastic learning experience for me. I also have an ongoing collaboration with the leadership at Nishtantega First Nation, and we also assist Nishtantega with some things through the Environmental Justice and Sustainability Clinic at Osgoode Hall Law School, where I teach. So, of course, I'm indebted to Chief Wayne Munias and the leadership in Nishtantega. You saw the elder Peter Munias in the video pulling in those nets. Those folks have been really instrumental in opening up my eyes to a lot of what's at stake in the debate over the Ring of Fire. My daily kind of co-conspirator in that work is David Pirla, who's also a Nishtantega advisor based in Thunder Bay. And it really feels like, you know, we're kind of in the thick of it. Things are developing every day and shifting constantly. And so I just want to acknowledge again the people of Treaty 9 and the struggle that they're engaged in, and say that I feel honored and privileged to have been able to work alongside folks just fighting to defend their decision-making authority on their homelands over the past few years. So thanks for having me.
Thank you, Dana. And, you know, it strikes me that this is a great way of doing personal introductions, because both of you have so located yourself not only relative to the land, but to the struggle, you know, the ways and to the people that have been a part of this struggle, the ones that you've been learning from, collaborating with. And so really, in many ways, you're moving us right into the conversation of the politics of it all. And I think we can jump into some of the questions. We've actually had a good time developing these questions. We had our first conversation with the two of you, and it was really fun because we thought, okay, what are the kinds of things you would really like to talk about and we would really like to know? So even that began the process, but we've continued to refine them. And I think I'm going to jump into one that kind of takes off from where you both have started to kind of name what you're dealing with now. I'm going to say we're in the midst of a provincial election. And Ford is lauding these bilateral deals with First Nations and even offered to jump on a bulldozer to start the construction of roads. The federal government, on the other hand, has promised regional assessment, but it doesn't seem to be Indigenous led. It's interesting how just a couple of days ago, Alberta, Court of Appeals was also charging this is unconstitutional. So we've got these layers of government in tension. What do we need to do? Can you help us understand the relationships here, both between the mining companies and the provincial and federal governments in this particular struggle? Dana, do you want to start jumping in on that one?
Sure, yes. Well, I guess I would start by saying most of the contention in the Ring of Fire right now is, for the moment, about roads, right? Even though it, of course, is about the proposed mining. And, in the early days, I don't know if people will remember, but it's stretching back 11 or more years now, when there were some fairly constructive negotiations going on between a group of 9 First Nations known as the Matawa First Nations Tribal Council. We're negotiating as a bloc with Ontario. So people may remember that Bob Rae was representing Matawa for the negotiations, and former Supreme Court Justice Frank Yakabuchi was representing Ontario. And it was slow progress, but they were making some progress. And those negotiations were built on the foundation of what they called the Unity Declaration, where all 9 of the Matawa nations were negotiating together as a bloc. They said they wanted to stand together as an expression of their pre-existing jurisdiction on the homelands. But eventually the settler state tactics just kind of wore that down, and they just kept pushing for bilateral deals. They said they wanted to work with communities that were mining ready, and that were willing to move at the speed of business. So they now have ended up with two communities that have entered into those agreements with Ontario, and those are agreements to become the proponents of roads for the purpose of environmental assessment. That's the situation we are now. And the thing I find, important to think about in that process is that, while they were negotiating as a bloc, the position was that there would be no road into the Ring of Fire until their jurisdiction was recognized. And here we are, 10 or more years later, and it seems like there will be no community infrastructure in Matawa communities until there's a road into the Ring of Fire, right? So Nishnawtika's under boil water advisory, 26 years. I mean, there is potentially some recent progress, and there's, a class action settlement, et cetera. But these communities are dealing with major infrastructure deficits, right, for basic community needs. And the government will only, kind of come to the table if there's a road to a mine site, at the end. So that's how I feel about the relationship between the mining companies. I mean, there was a piece in the Narwhal today that people should take a look at if they're interested in more about the road to the Ring of Fire, how much it will cost, who's going to pay for it. But it's the road that the mining companies want. It's the road that Ontario wants, and it now has 2 First Nation proponents. And it's broken up into 3 pieces. And those proponents have to engage in the environmental assessment regime like any other proponents do. And so they're in this consultation dynamic with their neighboring communities, and that's really fraught. Like it's a broken system in my view. And this is a place where that becomes like blatantly obvious to me.
Okay, so Donna, do you want to add to that from your experience and perspective?
Sure. Living in the North, being in the North, it's in some ways a different world. And it's true that the infrastructure, much of the infrastructure is lacking. Like the clean water advisories, especially in Neskantaga, going on, it's now at 25 years. But accessing clean water in communities, housing, let alone retrofitting homes to be green, in the sense that not relying so much on diesel and oil, or baseboard heaters, which requires hydroelectricity and so forth. We're much always downriver of a mine site or a mill or an extractive industry. I'm sorry, my dog is
Buddy.
acting like a cat.
Buddy
Yes,
before.
Buddy, everybody.
Oh, Buddy.
He always needs to be in the Zoom meetings. So just getting back to the point of, it is common experience for many Indigenous peoples to be at the forefront of extractive industry. And many times, I say we, we're pressured to participate in, yes, cash-based economy for jobs and so forth, but we're pressured to give up our lands, which much of the time means contaminating the water, contaminating the lands. So we don't get any funding to improve services. And the infrastructure, it's glaring. So when people come in the North, they see, well, why can't you recycle? Or why are the dumps so huge? Well, it's almost like a microcosm of what goes on in the bigger world. So when you come into the North, in any Indigenous community, you will see that it's different. And people will say, well, I see poverty. On one hand, you can ask people, well, what is wealth to you? And we'll tell you that harvesting our own medicines, our own food, knowing that we have clean water we can take from the lake, or we have clean tap water that we can trust that's without chemicals. So it's been a common story, a common experience, and it's heartbreaking when we're put in that position, basically at gunpoint. You're not going to get this funding if you don't participate in what we need to have a bigger Canadian strong economy. So much of the time, we're asked to sacrifice our health, our lives. So when you look at mining in Joan Kuyek's book, and I'm referring to here, Unearthing Justice, it's a good read. And if you can look at what are the full social and health costs, I ask you that now, and I bring that to the forefront. Ask those questions as settlers, as allies, as supporters of Indigenous autonomy, Indigenous sovereignty, support Indigenous jurisdiction, which means going to the people, learning from the people who are on the land, not in the office of provincial territorial organizations or tribal councils, but talking with folks like the leadership in Neskantaga and asking them what is wealth in the North, what is really needed, and how can we not sacrifice for electric vehicles? Like, how can we really support you? And I want to leave that there before I get into tangents. Thank you.
Oh, wow. Yeah, thank you. I mean, it makes me think, Dana, you did refer to, the roads as kind of now a focus in the two communities that are on the one hand seemingly supporting them. And I wonder if this would be a moment for you to share some of that, some of the maps that you have that could help us locate where this struggle is happening and exactly why some First Nations oppose the plans and others support them?
Sure. I'm going to flip over there now. I have a couple of maps here because I wanted to make the point about choosing the map has a lot of politics to it. So this first one is the one that Ontario often uses, and you can see why in a way, or the proponents use this map too. It's kind of blanked out on the right, which is where all of the Mushkegowuk downstream and down Muskeg communities are. And you'll see on the next maps what I mean. But the other thing here is that, you know, it does make it look like it's quite a distance between maybe the road or the mine site in Ontario or Yamatung. But if you look at this map, then you get a better sense of the Mushkegowuk communities at Awapiskat, Kashechewan, Fort Albany, et cetera, to the right there that are obviously going to be impacted by any developments in the Ring of Fire. You can see that some of the Matawa communities are differently situated in the sense that they already are connected to provincial road networks in the south. And of the 5 remotes in the top there, which mine is covered by you guys, but Nishnawtika, Nibenalnik, Yamatun, Martin Falls, and Webikwe. They're slightly differently situated in respect of the infrastructure proposal. So here's another map that Ontario is using to show us the road corridors for the 3 different pieces of road. And again, here you see the Webikwe Supply Road, which is the one kind of hashed in pink at the top. The Martin Falls Community Access Road is the green one that extends down and connects to the provincial road network in the south. And then the yellow one that connects those two is called the Northern Road Link. But of course, this is one north-south road into the proposed mine sites and connecting it to the provincial road network. And here's another map that shows you the watersheds, right? And so you can see that, for example, the Attawapiskat River watershed is the one in kind of darker blue that includes Nishnawtika, which is on the shores of Attawapiskat Lake and extends all the way out to the coast. And then again, if we go back through these maps, you can see the way in which the Northern Road Link, for example, will have to cross the Attawapiskat River and kind of, you know, bisect that entire watershed amongst other ones. So I just wanted to do that to show people, you know, it really depends what map you're looking at when you decide these things, but the communities are differently situated in the sense of not just their own like legal and political order that's tied to their territories, but in relation to the infrastructure routes that have been chosen and in relation to the potential impacts of any future mining as well. And of course, you know, the other thing to keep in mind is that like these developments are going to be contested within all of these communities, and there will be a diversity of political views, of course, about them. Even if it's, you know, I think it is the case that everyone who feels strongly about what should happen in this region with respect to critical minerals mining or any mining, I think is convinced that they see a way forward, you know, for young people and for the future, and they want to mitigate the social emergency that's going on. People differ about what the best way to do that is. That's how I feel about it. Donna might have more to say.
It is the dominant narrative right now to look at where are the jobs, what are the jobs. Youth need jobs, young people need jobs, and that's pretty much common experience and a message that people hear time and time again. So in terms of infrastructure, that is actually, again, getting the road built, getting access to the north to make it easier for minerals to be extracted and transported to certain sites for manufacturing and so forth, it's subsidized. And this is definitely a conversation that needs to happen. So why do some communities accept mining development while others not? Well, Dana said it well, that it's there. A lot of communities, Indigenous communities in the North, are approached all the time for mining because mining exploration is huge in the North. And it's that taking the crumbs, so to speak. If you look at what mining companies, after the mining is done, what they've profited and what they're leaving behind, that's where those full social and health costs are glaring. We have to deal with contamination, and that's a whole new issue on how long you have to deal with mercury. You have to deal with a whole host of contaminants that's left behind. So that's pretty much a dominant frame, is will offer jobs. So we need to look at what the longer term effects and the impacts are on people's, on the water, because again, the map showed the watersheds are vast, and we drink that water. Species, animals, birds, I mean, we rely on those waters. And of course, the land. It's a contentious issue on who owns the land. It's not Crown land to us. It's our homelands, the Innuug, Shinnuug, and the Anishinaabe people. And we have our own worldviews, our own perspectives. We're not left or right. We look at how can we provide for our families. And I'll say that there is great joy putting aside any human experience of small community politics, whatever you want to call it. When we feast, when we give each other food, in essence, that means a lot. Elders are so happy. It's a gift to nourish, to protect, to care for each other. And that means so much more than the dominance of games. So yes, we provide for each other. And for the longer term, we need to start looking at a different kind of political economy, not Canada's serving on a platter. We'll give up our lands and our health for you to have electric vehicles, and for the CEOs of mining companies to maintain their monies. But this is something that needs to happen. That conversation, we need to investigate ways to recycle, conserve. These aren't campaigns. They're not being talked about in the elections. Good. Oh, you're muted, Deborah.
We're moving into really the kinds of actions both of you have been involved in. I know over the years, also working on this kind of consent and contract work and trying to develop some with communities processes for regional assessment that take into account the broader issues of the social fabric. And I wonder if you could maybe both share some of the ways in which you see this ring of fire. It's not a fait accompli. I mean, when we spoke with you last, we were, wow, I mean, what can we do? What is being done and what can we do? And could you speak maybe also about some of the Indigenous-led climate solutions, So could we move into kind of the realm of action, if you could share with us a bit of what's being done in response to this aggressive push for developing the ring of fire on the breathing lands? And either one of you wants to jump in first.
Go ahead, Dana.
We're doing some work around the regional assessment, as you said, trying to really get some space for an Indigenous-led model on the regional assessment. I'm a little bit down on the regional assessment these days. I don't know if I put that on the top of my list of actions to get behind at the moment. It doesn't look like it doesn't look like we're going to end up with a model for that is really kind of, I guess, forward looking enough. It's not going to be led by Indigenous peoples. It's not going to be in a position to create it's not going to be able to create any conditions for the future project-based assessments that might happen. So I guess maybe I should flip this and speak on the other side. It could have been a nice planning tool for thinking about where would Indigenous peoples ideally see infrastructure developments within their territories. What are their priorities for like community, essential infrastructure from a community perspective? Do people see mining in their future? Where would they, which places would they envision that for, and which would they say are totally off limits? Like there could have been that kind of an exercise. And there was space within the Impact Assessment Act that the Ontario Alberta Court of Appeal says is unconstitutional. There was space in the Impact Assessment Act to do some of that, and there clearly was not the political will to pick up those tools and put them into action. So that's disappointing. And it's very clear now that the regional assessment will either expedite development in the region or completely just be irrelevant because it takes too long to come into being. Its scope is too small. It's led by a not credible panel of only settler appointees. And it mainly cannot stop the clock on the environmental assessments for the roads. So if the roads just proceed along, tearing through, and the regional assessment comes after, then we've lost the opportunity to do it that way. So that's where my sort of pessimism about the regional assessment comes from. But Donna usually has some more optimistic ideas than me.
Well, and also around, what are your visions? I mean, traditional economies and kind of Indigenous-led solutions that start with your own, traditional kind of practices.
Amplifying and listening to Indigenous people's solutions in the North. Hear what Nisga'a First Nation has to say. What does wealth mean to them? Support Indigenous localization of food. So the gardening, high cost of transportation, which doesn't need to be that, but supporting the localization of food, growing, gardening, food sovereignty, the food security. So providing seeds, support showing how to can foods, so localizing, but also localizing energy. I mean, right now, many Indigenous communities rely on diesel fuel to heat homes, oil, and hydroelectric heaters, furnaces. That's not energy efficient. And also being critical about renewables, because it does take critical rare minerals to make those solar panels with silica and coal in lots of places around the world. The wind turbines require certain minerals that are in China, in Africa. So that's not necessarily renewable. So breaking down the myths and looking at the bigger picture as well. So while you're supporting Indigenous, amplifying Indigenous jurisdiction sovereignty, look at what's already being done and what information is out there. And I'll say that there's a lot of food sovereignty going on in the North, small efforts, yet greater impact because people see it being demonstrated. So I would say support those. And finding out what's happening with certain groups like Indigenous Climate Action. We have our pathways, our programs on sovereignty, on healing justice, not just gatherings, but also looking at training, building capacity with young people. There is that, and also Indigenous Environmental Network. They're based out of Minnesota, and they have they work in Canada as well, supporting communities to not only resist extraction, but also build up solutions. So what we're fighting on one hand, but we're also generating an economy that is based on Indigenous principles, such as working together to protect the earth, again, from extraction, but also build up that capacity intergenerationally with young people to protect the earth. So there's a lot of information on both websites, especially IEN, regarding carbon output, false climate solutions, and looking at just transition. That's something that I don't see being talked about in the North. And yes, it's a buzz term. I'm careful about buzz terms. Basically, that means the need to stop relying on diesel, on extraction, fossil fuels, and moving into renewables. Again, looking at being more critical about what are those, what works on a small scale that has a big impact on community in a positive way, but also regionally. So looking at energy plans, Indigenous energy plans for our communities, so supporting those, and reach out to these organizations. And I'll tell you that there are a lot of nonprofits doing work. And I would say even with SCAN, having platforms like this is so critical. Miigwech.
Miigwech,
Can I add something else? Yeah. So Donna just made me remember about, and I think this example actually proves the point about what is so wrong with, the kind of approaches to environmental assessment and the duty to consult that we are going with now. And that is, Nishnawtiga, has been trying to pursue a lake sturgeon stewardship program for several years now. And, in fact, was successful in securing funding for one right at the beginning of the pandemic, and was not able to get the program off the ground in the past 2 years, understandably, because of the multiple overlapping crises that have affected the community, which is very small. But interestingly, right, over that period of time that Nishnawtiga's capacity was so strapped, dealing with real community emergencies, that they weren't able to get anywhere in terms of advancing their own vision for a lake sturgeon stewardship program. They were still, over that whole period, bombarded with consultation requests from the Crown and from proponents, and demands to respond and join webinars and read long letters and documents, et cetera. So the whole system is set up to just keep making demands on those limited capacities. And those demands are all coming from outsiders' priorities for their territories. And they're meant to kind of channel their very scarce resources towards responding to those questions and demands, and being consulted in those systems, such that their own priorities have gone to the wayside. And structurally, there's so much wrong with that system. But the nice part is that, it does look like Nishnawtiga is going to get their lake sturgeon stewardship program going. And there's other things going on across the North in terms of different Indigenous guardians and stewardship programs. I see that Cheryl from WCS is on the call, I think, and she's worked on some of those. And so that's definitely something that's worth supporting, I think, and really trying to make space for, right? Just make space.
Well, I think a lot of the examples that you've given of organizations and we can include, they're in the chat. We're going to have further conversation, and some of the people that are working in those projects are represented here. So I know that we're actually almost out of time for our particular conversation, but I have one last question I would just like to put forward, and then we can continue that conversation with others through the questions that have come in the chat and with some of the other people we have who can speak to them as well. And that is about your collaboration. You know, we're particularly interested in what are the ways in which settlers and Indigenous activists, and whatever word you use, I love it, a way of life. Instead of activism, it's a way of life. The ways in which you have collaborated and what we can learn from that, you know, as settlers that are you know, learning and trying to find ways to work collaboratively in ways that will be supportive and useful in this struggle. Donna?
I do want to say that circular economy is another thing that's being talked about these days. And again, it's looking at the recycling and remanufacturing materials, metals. So that's something that the Ring of Fire, why get into it when we know that we can definitely recycle the metals, and why it's just bizarre. It's again that that addiction, not just to oil, but to consume. And you can say that about any economy, capitalism. It's just, it doesn't make sense, especially when the Green Energy the Green Energy Economy Act was canceled a few years ago. This was something that Indigenous communities were just starting to get into, small wind energy, small wind water turbines, and it was cut. And now they're talking about electric vehicles. So I would say, again, reduce the carbon output, really look at transportation needs in the north, look at the manufacturing. There's no need to have more vehicles. We're in a state of crisis as Earth warming up too fast. So there's a whole science there, but we need to bring Western science and traditional knowledge to start thinking outside of the crisis. We need to start being smart about our future. And I just want to say that I don't have children of my own. I've always been an auntie. I've raised my stepkids. But I see this as for all children, their grandchildren. We won't see these efforts, yet it's important to do this work, because if we love them that much, we'll do what we can to make sure that they're safe, that they're cared for.
Which, yes, for the 7 generations to come. Dana? You want to have last word? We want to move into the Q&A, so.
Sure. So I won't speak long, and you know, just on the collaboration point, I guess I would say that, like, the thing is, like, you know, it's always hard and it's always a work in progress. We make mistakes. I especially make mistakes. I'm always rushing, you know, I'm applying like the university stupid rules, as Donna knows, that like have a disproportionate impact on the community-based researcher and don't really have an adverse impact on the university-based researcher, right? Like, if we recognize that power dynamic and we try to mitigate it, but we can't really erase it, and we can't pretend that it's not there. And there are a lot of challenges, and they're not ones that you can just encounter once and convince yourself that there's some useful role for you in the work that you want to do and then let it go past, right? It's actually every single decision. It's about whether we do this particular project and whether we, you know, travel in this place and whether we do this particular interview or whatever. But I think an orientation of like trying to be useful and being willing to do the work, I think is kind of like the only way to make those collaborations work, and to try to, I guess the other thing I would say is, like, for us, I think it's held together by a common politics, right? That means it's always contingent. it's not a thing where you say we're whatever. For me anyway, it's not to say, well, whatever the community decides, that's what I'm going to get behind. There are some researchers that go with that orientation, I think, into collaborating with Indigenous partners or communities. But in my view, we're working on a common project, and as long as it's a common project and we're kind of working through it together, and I'm trying to make sure I'm pulling my weight, doing the work and being useful, then it's working for now, I think, is maybe how I would say it.
Well, thank you. It certainly resonates with me too. This is an ongoing process. We'll have a chance to come back to you later in the informal time, but I at this point want to pass the mic to Terry, who has been monitoring the questions coming in through the chat, because we want to make space for others also to bring both their questions and some of their comments, because we have some also people here who have been working on these issues for many, many years. So Terry, it's all yours.
Hey, thank you, Deborah. That was a wonderful conversation, and there's lots of comments and questions in chat that we'll get to in just a second. I want just to remind people that if you've got anything you want to comment on or a question you want to ask, please put it in chat. I noticed that Catherine from Toronto has got her hand up, but with 150, almost 138 people, we would prefer if you could put the comment or question in the chat function, and then we can sort of organize how we get at some of those issues. The chat box, all the comments and questions that are put in there, we're going to copy them, and we're going to organize them a little bit, and we're going to send them to every single member who's a person who's registered for this event. So you'll get all of that stuff, including all of the links to various books, and organizations and other references that are contained in that chat. We'll do that as a matter of course, so you don't have to worry about copying that or rushing to get that down personally. We'll send that out to you probably tomorrow. So there's a couple of questions here which I think are all centered around access roads and environmental assessment, and understanding the relationship between environmental assessment and the ability of various companies to already engage in activities outside of having an environmental assessment take place that gives them, the go-ahead. So I take it, and I think that this is important that we talk. Environmental assessment is not about determining whether or not something goes forward. It's about something else, especially given the fact that Indigenous people are not leading this exercise. And earlier there was a reference in the video about the amount of exploration activity that's already taking place on Indigenous territory without free, prior, and informed consent. So could we spend a couple of minutes just talking about what the relationship is between environmental assessment and the approval process for all this stuff that's already going on? Who wants to tackle that first? Donna, Dana?
Dana, you can go.
Right. Well, yeah. So exploration happens without any environmental assessment in Ontario and most jurisdictions, as far as I know. It's still some version of what we call a free entry system. So you do your staking, you automatically acquire rights, and you can drill. It's even the case that in mines themselves, well, people maybe here will correct me, but I'm pretty confused about whether the mine itself at Eagle's Nest will require any form of environmental assessment before it could get underway. And that's because, at least in the federal legislation, there's a really high threshold for the size of the mine that would trigger a federal impact assessment. And in Ontario, Ford has been up to all kinds of shenanigans with the Environmental Assessment Act. So, that legislation is only as good as we make it, and we haven't made it very good in the past little while. except for the federal act, which, as I said, has some promising aspects to it, but obviously some shortfalls too. So it's not necessarily, and then even when environmental assessment applies, maybe one of your questioners is getting at this, it almost always approves the projects. It's a system for putting in a few mitigating conditions here and there. It's not a process for stopping projects, and certainly not for stopping them on the basis of a lack of Indigenous consent.
Okay, so Donna, do you have anything to add to that before I go on with a kind of related question having to do with aerial spraying? That's related to some of the exploration and development activity taking place on your territory. Do you have anything you want to add first before we get to that?
Free, prior, and informed consent is quite simple. And as Wayne Munia said, consultation, consent, speak with Indigenous communities, Indigenous peoples impacted. It's that process, current process, that is so limited right now. And it's pretty straightforward to speak and collaborate, consult Indigenous peoples on any issue.
Okay, so it seems that, when people talk about exploration and kind of, early development of a mining operation, it can sound benign. It can sound, oh, well, that's not a huge impact, but there's been lots of studies and there's been lots of people focusing on, no, that's not true at all. There can be huge impacts from the exploration that can take place without any environmental assessment, without any approval of the folks who are on that traditional territory. So could we talk just a little bit about the relationship, the kinds of impacts, that kind of exploration and development, the grid patterns that are cut through the forest, the impact that has, let's say, on caribou herds, and potentially the impact that has on the release of carbon from the peat that's stored underneath. Could we talk a little bit about that? Who wants to start? Donna?
Sure. So when that happens, it's people who go to those particular spots, their traditional lands, where their relatives are buried. It's tragic when I hear that it's been disrupted, the place has been used, or there are so many tanks for getting ready to unearth, to take on mining exploration. People are devastated. How dare they come onto these lands and disrupt what's going on? This chases away the beaver, this chases away the moose, the caribou. So definitely it's instinctual. When we see it, it's a violation. And that isn't really discussed.
Okay. Dana, do you have anything to add to that? Okay, so one of the questions in chat has to do with whether or not there's any carbon accounting that takes place in terms of accounting for Canada's or Ontario's emissions that really takes a good look at, well, what is the impact of disrupting these peat bogs that contain, from what I understand, the second largest storehouse of sequestered carbon on the planet. That seems to be a very big number and a very big issue, but does it in any way, shape, or form have to be accounted for, in the way in which emissions are accounted for in terms of how countries have to control their emissions under the Paris Accords, for example? Dana?
Under the Paris Accord, I think, yes, the country would have to have some measures in place to try and account for like a much more vague assessment of what the change has been from land use over a certain reporting period. But in terms of, again, it's somewhere we could think about the environmental assessments and the regional assessment as an example. There would have been an opportunity to try and think through that very kind of dilemma that you're pointing out. You know, we can, if Ontario is right, we can, you know, reduce our carbon dioxide emissions by switching lots of folks to electric vehicles. And that's one of the, they say, one of the only things that we can do that would be able to reduce our emissions relatively quickly in a place like Ontario. And therefore, we have to do it from a kind of a climate mitigation perspective. The regional assessment is a tool that could have been able to open up an assessment of that, so that the people of Ontario would have a bunch of data in front of them, right? About like how much do we think our emissions can come down if we, you know, are able to switch a certain number of folks to electric vehicles, versus how much carbon is likely to be released in the peatlands in order to get those minerals and et cetera. Like we could have generated some data and tried to look at it from a more holistic perspective and make better planning decisions, long-term decisions that way. That's, I think, how the debate from a scientific perspective has gone down. And CBC did a program on What on Earth, I guess, which is about that very dilemma, like how much carbon will be released versus how many emissions could be saved. But of course, even that framing kind of downplays the Indigenous jurisdiction and like what's actually at stake in terms of the homelands in the North. So I'm not a scientist, but I would think there's some stuff missing even in that framing of it as well.
So there is a question in chat about the group of 9 First Nations that had attempted to work together and 2 were broken off or broke off. Are those negotiations over, or are the other 7 still working together? And are they trying to collaborate on a kind of common strategy or a set of demands that they want to advance that we should know about?
I think there isn't, no. The shortest answer is probably no. There isn't a set of common demands. The Matawa Tribal Council is pursuing some of its own economic development projects in relation to the Ring of Fire and critical minerals possibilities, I think, and some of those have been made public, but the deliberations amongst the 9, and the 9 chiefs are still members of the Matawa Tribal Council, I don't think has produced any unanimous positions in a little while.
Donna, do you have anything to add to that at all, or we move on?
Again, it comes down to Indigenous jurisdiction with your former question and then looking at this question now. We need to shift that political dynamic right now that Ontario and the Crown, they claim it's their land and it's not. So thank you for that there, Dana. Rich.
Okay, so we are in the middle of a provincial election campaign. And one of the questions in chat has to do with the position of political parties and whether or not any one is better than the other relative to each other. I take it, and one of the issues would be with respect to the rights of Indigenous people, the free, prior, and informed consent issue. What's your take on this? Are the parties in an equal place on this? I noticed that sometimes they seem to all come behind the Ring of Fire development and pass motions that are in favor of it. Are there any political parties vying for votes during the June 2nd election that are actually supporting the free, prior, informed consent for Indigenous peoples to say yes or no, and on what terms for development in the Ring of Fire?
I have not seen any party who has a position that really impresses me on this. I will say that Sol Mamakwa, who is the NDP rep in the far north, has the best position in respect of free, prior, and informed consent, and obviously I think is the most informed about the issues. So take from that what you like. He's the NDP member.
Donna, do you have a view on that? Which political party would be, one we would look at more closely because they're more aligned with protecting a free, prior, informed consent?
The elections is a foreign system to us. I do know that there are Indigenous peoples that do vote. And I echo Dana in hearing about Solomon Makwa, NDP candidate for this area. But I don't see anything that stands out, unfortunately.
Okay, now there's lots of comments and questions that remain in chat that we haven't had a chance to take a look at, but we're approaching 8:30, and so I think what we ought to do is I'm going to pitch this back to Pramila, because I think we should probably say thank yous and call an end to the formal portion of this and invite people to stick around for what we're calling after chat, where we can focus on some of the outstanding issues and maybe address some of the ones we haven't had a chance to talk about yet. Pramila?
What a rich discussion. And of course, it's not over yet. But my name is Pramila, and I am here to make some concluding thanks, actually, from SCAN, the Seniors for Climate Action Now, and Environment Halliburton, the two co-sponsors for this event. And it really gives me a lot of pleasure to thank the organizers for pulling it together, this forum, such a great forum, and the members of SCAN for their support and encouragement to launch it, and to all of you, the participants, for your interest in learning how Indigenous ways of knowing and working can mitigate climate crisis, and to Deborah for your brilliant moderating of the conversation. But most of all, to Donna and Dana Miigwech for sharing your knowledge, experience, research, wisdom, organizing, and activism to help us and help save breathing lands that have sustained human and non-human life for thousands of years. The Indigenous elders have likened these lands to the lungs of Mother Earth, for they clean the air, provide us with freshness, and keep the earth cool. As well, these lands are unrivaled in their ability to regulate climate. And as both Donna and Dana have pointed out, there is an opportunity, there is still time to stop the Canadian government and mining companies from bulldozing the breathing lands under the pretext of development. And it is high time to stop terraforming. It is time to recognize our responsibility, that we have a responsibility for future generations, that our survival depends on protecting all our relations to land, air, water, animals. And with that, I would say that we have so much to learn and so much work to do. And so, Miigwech, and off to Terry.
Okay, thank you for that, Pramila, and thank you for everybody who's been participating up to this point. So for those who can and want to and are able to hang around for a little bit longer, both Dana and Donna have agreed to participate in what we're calling after chat, which is to try to, to focus and double back on some of the things we haven't had a chance to talk about that are the comments or questions that are in chat, or for you to put new questions in there that you haven't had a chance to do so far. So I'll go back to the chat, but if anybody has got any additional comments or questions, please put them in the chat box, and I'll attempt to come and ask you to put the question. So there are a couple of things, again, about that go back to the disturbing of the peatlands. And there's one thing that we really haven't mentioned much about, but it's the permafrost. And the fact that the peat protects permafrost, and that it contains and it sequesters methane, which depending on how much and how fast it gets released, can have a detrimental effect, which is many times that of carbon dioxide. So is there something you could say, either one of you, about the relationship between the peatlands and the sequestering of methane in the permafrost, and how these roads and how development in this area maybe bring us face to face with the releasing of a significant amount of that stored carbon? Dana, Donna, either one of you?
I just want to say, I think you're raising the right questions. These are the questions I wish Ontario was interested in looking into.
Can you hear?
Okay.
Someone else on the call probably knows much better than me how to answer that question.
I agree. Are there other folks that can speak to this? Because this is not discussed again. And these are issues that we need to speak about.
If there's anybody who does have some specific knowledge of this that wants to raise your hand, and we could recognize you so you could say something about this, please do so. So there's a Lauren Harris that's raised.
It's Lorna Harris.
Lorna, sorry, okay.
Hi there. Hi, sorry, Lorna Harris here from WCS Canada. I'm a forest, peatlands and climate change scientist. I've been studying peatlands for around 17 years. So the questions that you have on, the carbon issue for the Ring of Fire, the peatlands in that region, they cover, 90% of that area. I roughly calculated around 450 million tons of carbon within the area covered by mining claims, which is around 1.6 billion tons of carbon dioxide. And then I've done other scenarios. So say if 10% of the Ring of Fire was to be developed, that's only around 500 square kilometers. So it's not very likely, but say if that was going to be reduced to 10%, it's still 45 million tons of carbon and 165 million tons of carbon dioxide. These are huge amounts of potential greenhouse gas emissions. And bearing in mind that Canada's National Inventory Report, its reported greenhouse gas emissions is around 730 million tons of.
You heard what she said. It's too bad Ontario doesn't worry more about this.
Yeah, so it is the greenhouse gas emissions can be quite huge.
I just want to remind people to mute yourself if you're not being asked to unmute and speak, because that sometimes makes it difficult for the rest of us to hear. So maybe I could make just a quick question to Donna about this. And you've talked about traditional economy and about the impact that this kind of a development can have on traditional ways of being able to just have your sustenance, the hunting, the gathering, the fishing and so on. One of the things that was mentioned in a recent Narwhal article had to do with the caribou herd and the impact that access roads and mining exploration has on diminishing caribou herds. And they give an example of a development in Quebec where access roads decimated a caribou herd that many Indigenous people were dependent upon. So given the fact that hunting is a very important part of traditional economies in this area, what would the impact be on the caribou herd that's resident in this area?
The impacts are actually huge. That would mean an extinction of certain animals, or for long term, if mining continues, it would have a devastating effect on people's lives, and not just for Indigenous people, for us to feed ourselves, our family, that whole traditional knowledge, and the relationship to that caribou would be gone. But also what that caribou brings, their contribution to this world. All species, all people, all humans have an impact, a contribution while on this earth. And we have stories to the caribou. We have a creation, the Crees, I'm Cree, and Inuit, and we have a creation story. Our creation story talks about that permafrost, that way back to the Ice Age. So it's long-standing, and to see a relative gone forever would be devastating spiritually. It would impact our peoples. And again, what's to say who is next in terms of our relatives? Would it be the black bear? Would it be the beaver? And all of these animals have a contribution in the ecosystem. So when we hunt, we don't overhunt. We're careful about not shooting or over harvesting fish, beaver, caribou, because we know that will affect our lives, our livelihood, and our relationship to that natural world. We would be welcoming sickness into our families and our communities. So we're careful about that balance in the natural world. So we are part of this environment, we are part of this natural world, and they are kin. The caribou are kin to us. So that's our relationship, and that's our responsibility, is to protect the earth, to protect those lands and waters.
Okay. So there's a number of comments and questions about how we can support, how a number of people could support Indigenous attempts to protect their traditional territories. And there's a reference here to where it's a question about where to send donations in support of the Nescatana court case. Could someone say something about that court case and indicate where donations to support that might be sent?
Sure. Yeah. The place to direct the donations would be the Raven Trust, which is an organization that raises funds for litigation that builds Indigenous self-determination and environmental protection. So thank you, Cheryl. The campaign is there, and the specific Nishnantika litigation is about the dynamic I was speaking about a little bit, and that is the demands for consultation that the proponents in Ontario were making of Nishnantika during the pandemic. So basically, people will know the duty to consult and accommodate is a common law doctrine in Canada. That means it's a set of rules that have been made up by judges that are interpreting Section 35 in our Constitution, which affirms the Aboriginal and treaty rights of Indigenous peoples. And so basically what it requires is that the Crown has this duty as part of the honor of the Crown to let Indigenous people know when it's about to make incursions onto their territories, and to find out how Indigenous people feel about those incursions, basically, and to make some attempts at accommodation where it's, possible for them. That's what the judges require, basically. And what Nishnantika wanted to know was that in the context of a pandemic, when they were dealing with a whole bunch of overlapping social crises, so, the water crisis was on, there was a whole community evacuation in that first September based on the water system completely being shut down. And, the travel restrictions were in place because of the pandemic, and people were extremely worried about the vulnerability of people in small remote communities to the virus, where, there's not a lot of health services on hand. Some people have, exacerbating health conditions, etc. And overcrowded housing is a major risk factor. So the community leadership was dealing with all of these very pressing demands. And as I explained before, they were also Ontario and the proponents were asking them to read their documents and reply by a certain date or whatever. And advisors for Nishnantika just kept writing back to the proponent and the Crown and saying, you need to pause the environmental assessment during the period of the pandemic. We are not able to respond right now. And Ontario's response was, sorry, environmental assessment is proponent driven in Ontario, and only the proponent can stop the clock, right? And of course, remember in this case, the proponents are the neighboring First Nation communities, with Ontario paying their bills and paying their consultants. And so it's this whole complex mess of relations. And the bottom line is they wouldn't stop, they would not pause. And so what we did is brought a challenge, Nishnantika did, is brought a challenge to the court, which asks the court to answer the question of what the duty to consult requires when an Indigenous community is in crisis. And if it is in fact a constitutional duty, and the duty is that consultation must be meaningful, then the argument was that there must be a way to stop the clock. Otherwise, those legislated timelines must be unconstitutional. That is the argument that is before the court. But of course, it's dragging out now, as these things do. And so, yes, support for the legal campaign would be excellent.
Okay, and Cheryl has put a link to where you would send any donations to support that kind of legal challenge. How does this particular legal challenge fit into the moratorium that was requested, I think it was last year, with regard to stopping all development until there was a meaningful kind of Indigenous-led environmental assessment process put in place that takes a look at not just the roads, but everything that's related to that. Where does that moratorium stand, and how does it fit with the kind of legal action that we're just talking about? You're muted, Dana.
Sorry, I was asking Donna if I should just keep on going.
Hmm.
Yeah, the moratorium. Okay, so the moratorium is more like an expression of inherent jurisdiction, right? So those chiefs of those 3 or 4 communities, 5 maybe, came together to make an expression of Indigenous law, right? Under their inherent jurisdiction. They are not allowing any mining developments on their territories. The settler state has not acknowledged or given any effect to that moratorium. So the kind of legal action that Nishnantika is taking is a strategic engagement with settler law in settler courts to try and get a remedy to a pressing problem because the state is not listening, basically.
Okay, so there is another question in chat about the effect that UNDRIP and the passing of that federally would have on the Ring of Fire. Is there some comments that you could make about that? Does that have any effect whatsoever? And what does the effect of Doug Ford's government saying basically that does not plan to in any way, shape, or form follow suit with respect to recognizing UNDRIP within any provincial legislation?
Just briefly, I can say the federal act says that Canada intends to bring its law into line with UNDRIP. It couldn't be more vague about whether it requires Canadian law today to be in line with UNDRIP, or whether its aspiration is to bring its laws in line with UNDRIP. We will need some court interpretation to tell us what the passing of that law has meant. And there's also one in British Columbia. I forget the second part of your question.
The issue of whether or not federal law in relationship to Doug Ford's unwillingness to pass any amendment to existing Ontario legislation.
You know what, right now, I haven't seen, so it's the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And then there is a federal law that implements those obligations. You know what? There's no real difference right now between what the feds have done and what Ontario is saying they have no intention of doing.
Okay.
And yeah. could go on. Let Donna comment.
Well, there are so many threads to this conversation, and I think that we've covered much of the, if not most of the comments and questions that in chat. Again, I encourage people to have a look at the chat links and so on and so forth that we put there. And one of the first things that I put in right off the top was references to SCAN's 10 Reasons to Defeat Ford. That's on the SCAN website. There's a reference to Doug Ford's climate crimes. And there's a specific reference to SCAN's climate crime number 9, which has to do with the Ring of Fire suffocating Indigenous breathing lands. So all of those links are in the chat and will be forwarded to you probably first thing tomorrow. So I think with that, I think Deborah, do you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge that we have some people attending that have been very involved in this issue, and I'd like to just see if any of them would like to speak. I'm thinking Jamie from Mining Watch. I know Donna works closely with Mining Watch as well, but Jamie, do you have something that you'd like to add to the conversation at this point?
Jamie, if you can put your hand up, if you, one way or the other, either hand up or thumbs down, I guess would be the answer to that question. I'm not sure Jamie's still on the in the meeting.
If Jamie isn't there, I want to acknowledge Joan Kuyak. Joan, are you still here? And and Joan's book that's already been referred to, but I want to say it was dedicated to Donna, and your partner wrote the prologue, the introduction, and it's an incredible tool for communities that are fighting this and useful not only in the Canadian context, but has, of course, also an understanding of the global reach of Canadian mining. So a sharing of strategies across those communities. You might want to say more about that, Donna, but I was very touched by that, the way in which you worked. And if Joan is here, she might have something to say as well. Donna?
Oh, I'm so glad that you brought up or showed the book. That's definitely an excellent resource tool for people interested in finding out what exactly does what's the process of mining in Canada, and not only an excellent tool for Indigenous communities, but worldwide in other continents. Because again, as you know, Canadian mining companies are all over the world, and we need more critical resources to support the building up knowledge, so we can understand how we can do this better in dealing with extraction and ensuring that emissions are brought down, because it's happening too fast. We do have deadlines to meet, and the more knowledge that we can create and talks and collaborate amongst ourselves, we're better for it. I would love to hear from Joan if she's on.
Joan, are you there?
Joan, if you're there, could you raise your hand? It's in the reactions.
She was here, and Jamie.
Yeah, I know. So was Jamie, but I think they may have.
We still have, there were 3 days, and there's still one that I can see there, and that's Judith Marshall.
Oh, okay.
Been very, very engaged in this anti-mining movement over many years. Judith, I see you there at the top. Maybe you have something to say. Can you put your hand up? Yeah, there you are.
Well, it's true that Jay is part of my name, but with Joan and Jamie in the triangle, they are the experts way beyond me. I'm a relative newcomer to this, but once you stumble into the world of mining, you find that there is a rich amount to get very angry about. I guess the only thing I'd want to say, if I had to draw one lesson from the work I've bumped into in Brazil, in Mozambique, and here in Canada with the Mount Polley mine and the tailings dam collapse there. And I guess if there's one lesson I drew from it, is just to really recognize the historical moment in terms of neoliberalism and the reversal of roles between governments and corporations. So After Mount Polley, the study done in British Columbia, the audit of mining, actually the auditor herself spoke of regulatory capture as the problem in British Columbia, that essentially the government was bought by the companies. And that absolutely we have to take as our starting point for any of this work, that it's not a question of telling governments how to do it better. They're not interested in doing it better. And they're not prepared to defend workers, communities, or so, you know, taking that as our starting point, I think gets us off on a better footing, and to really think about civil society and space. So this new organization of seniors, I mean, just looking at the people who are around this table tonight, we've all been around the block a few times, and there's a lot of talent out there and a lot of smarts in terms of reading situations, both in our own country and other parts of the world. So trying to think creatively what to be done at this moment, and where we can put energies and spaces where critical discussions are happening, and how we enlarge them and connect them up. So I don't know what Jamie or Joan would have said, but that's Judith's 2 bits for the evening.
Judith, that's wonderful. And we actually have Jamie on his bicycle. So I don't know, Jamie, can you speak from your bicycle? Maybe not. But thank you, because your work globally also, you know, really is so important to understand. This struggle is one that, yes, Canadian mines are everywhere. We saw it all through Latin America over decades.
So Deborah, maybe you could just, oh, Jamie's on? That'd be great. Because
I can, yeah, I'm out of traffic now. I can, I can say a few words, but I don't know if I've got much more to add other than to, you know, reinforce what people have been saying. And I mean, this process is really important. This kind of get together is very important. You know, I think the key to all of this is building bridges, building relationships, building community, and working together to try and change things. So, you know, and whether that's with, you know, communities within the country, but in very starkly different, you know, within the province, starkly different realities, or globally, I think it's all really important. So I you know, I look forward to the Sandaga court case eventually coming through. I look forward to hearing from more of the folks that are on this call, and seeing more of this coming out, and yeah, maybe even in the election campaign to say what are the real issues here. I mean, I'm astonished that there's no party, no opposition party is taking up the fact that thousands of elders of all nations have been killed in this province during the pandemic for profit. And I'm astonished that reconciliation is becoming a 4-letter word and not, you know, not being given the kind of meaning that I think Senator St. Clair and the commissioners, the Truth and Reconciliation commissioners, meant it to have. So, you know, there's all kinds of opportunities to make more of the situation. I think that's pretty much all I have to say.
Wonderful. Thank you. I mean, this is also a moment for developing more alliances, even in this time of when we can't meet. We can meet virtually, and the organizations that are represented here and in the chat are ones that we can all be connecting with, and certainly joining forces with, not only this particular moment of the provincial election, but with what we know is an ongoing struggle. But we have the inspiration of other ways of knowing and thinking and understanding our relationship, which for me also this evening was a wonderful counterpoint to understanding the obstacles, is that there is a vision there. And you represented it, Donna, with this, with your community, with your sense of all of the relations, and we are here to support that process, not only in your community and in the breathing land, but wherever we are, because we're all dealing with it wherever we stand.
So Deborah, maybe we could end this portion by referencing Nick DiCarlo's comment in chat, where he's saying that reminding us all that there's a demonstration on Saturday at Queen's Park at 1 p.m. And that's another opportunity to deepen the relationships and build the kinds of movement that we need to be able to challenge the kind of development model that we're all trying to deal with in Northern Ontario and all over, that's fueling the climate emergency and other environmental crises. So maybe we could end there. I will just say that there's one person who's just asked again about a recording. We will get a recording of this session together as soon as we can. We'll lightly edit it and we'll put it up on SCAN's YouTube channel as soon as we possibly can. So with that, I guess I'll turn things back to Deborah and Pramila and for some final good nights.
Well, thank you, Terry, for an amazing job of kind of curating all of those questions, and also jumping in and really kind of weaving together the stories. Yeah, I am so grateful to have had the opportunity to work with Donna and Dana. I hope that we continue this conversation and this relationship in other ways. And Pramila, you can.
Well, I just want to say just one thing. It was so beautifully done, Donna. I'm going to carry it in my heart, is when you said that caribou is our kin, and when we lose our kin, we lose a relation, we lose our close one. And I think that is a worldview, which is what we need to have. If we don't, we are doomed. And I think that is the most pressing, how everything we exist in relationships. And if we don't recognize it, they don't need us, we need them. That is the earth doesn't need us, we need the earth. So thank you. And you were just amazing, all of you. I want to take you home.
So to be continued.
To be continued. Miigwech.
Miigwech.